quite amazing. And let me tell you another thing about myself. When I was in high school, I joined the poetry club. And I was in a poetry club. We had meetings once a month for 3 years. I never wrote a single damn poem that was any good. And I was in this poetry club with 6 wonderful young ladies who wrote beautiful poetry. They wrote sonnets. That's impossible. Even Shakespeare had trouble with those at times. But I was not a poet. It was terrible. And when I published the Martian Chronicles, I got a person approached me, a friend, and said, Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New Worlds, wants to meet you. I said, he does? He said, yes, he wants you to come to have tea someday with him. Well, I hated tea, but I loved Aldous Huxley. And I went to have tea with him one day, and he leaned forward, and he said, Mr. Bradbury, do you know what you are? I said, what am I? He said, you're a poet. You're a poet. I said, oh my God. I was wondering a poet. I didn't know that.
Didn't know it.
That's all in the Martian Chronicles. So then I began to write more poetry as the years went by, but nothing really good until I was 42. When I was 42 years old, the phone rang, and it was the editor of Pro Football magazine that was published in all the stadiums for the pro football teams across the United States. And he said, Mr. Bradbury, you love football, don't you? I said, yes, I do. He said, will you write an article for Pro Football magazine for me? I said, no, I don't think I can do that. He said, we'll give you a lot of money. I said, forget it. I don't write for money. I write for love. He said, your brother was a professional football player, wasn't he? I said, yes, he was. Very proud of him. Well, then why don't you write for it? I said, I can't think of a way to do it, but thank you very much. So I hung up the phone, and I sat there by the phone thinking about football. When I was 17 years old, in high school, going to my first game, and the weather, and my friends, and my love of the game, it was beautiful. So sitting there by the phone, I wrote a 3-page poem about football. Now what in the hell do you do with that? So I thought, what the hell? I'll send you Pro Football magazine. Anyway, it's a crazy thing to do. Maybe they'll accept it. So I sent you Pro Football magazine, and the next day a letter came back with a check for me for $500. They bought that poem. A letter from the editor of Pro Football magazine saying, I've sent a copy of your poem to my father. I said, how unusual. When's the last time you sent a poem to your father? So it was published the next Sunday in 20 stadiums across the United States. And millions of people read that one poem of mine. And then in the months following that, it was published 2 more times. It was published 3 times in Pro Football magazine. Can you imagine that? People up in the same seats, and a guy turns to his friends and says, Joe, look, there's a poem here in Pro Football magazine. Shall we read it? Oh, okay. So that poem changed my life. And I began to write more and more poetry. And I have a book out now called They Have Not Seen the Stars that has 300 poems in it. So you see it finally happens. If the love is there, finally it happens. And these things occur to you. It's a good example of the way I behaved during my life. But one of the ways I learned to write poetry, let me give you an example. I went to my hometown, walking in Illinois when I was 19. And I went down to get on the bus, and I looked in the cigar store window, and there was a copy of John Steinbeck's Great Grapes of Wrath. And I bought a copy of that book from the cigar store people and took it on the bus and traveled on Route 66, the same route that Okies took, traveling to California. That is that novel, Grapes of Wrath. And I love that book. I got an incredible, wonderful experience. And I got a letter about 20 years ago, and a young fan wrote me and said, Mr. Bradbury, I've just read your Martian Chronicles, and are you aware of the fact that maybe John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath influenced you to write the Martian Chronicles? I said, oh my God, yes. Yeah, because every other chapter of Steinbeck is a prose poem. Every other chapter is plot with characters, but every other chapter is a prose poem. You go take a look at Grapes of Wrath, and that influenced me, and I love that book so much that when I wrote the Martian Chronicles. Now, when I got married, I lived in Venice, California. The first year was great, but the second year, my wife became pregnant. She was working. She supplied a lot of money that kept us going because I sold jewelry stories only occasionally for $30 a piece. And Norman Corwin said to me, now your wife has got to stop working. Why don't you come to New York and let people know that you exist? So I went to New York and met all the editors, and they all wanted novels from me. I didn't write novels, and they didn't like my short stories. And on my last night in New York City, I went to have lunch with the editor of Doubleday. His name was Walter Bradbury, no relation to me. But during dinner, he said, Ray, I think you've written a novel, but you don't know that you've written it. I said, what do you mean? He said, what about all those Martian stories you wrote that appeared in Thrilling Wonder Stories and Captain Future and Astounding Science? Wouldn't they make a plot? If you tied all those Martian stories together, wouldn't they make a book called The Martian Chronicles? I said, oh my God. He said, why do you say, oh my God? I said, because I read a book when I was 23 called Winesburg, Ohio. And I said to myself, oh God, someday, if I could write a book half as good as Winesburg, Ohio, I'd be happy. So I made notes at that time, and without knowing it, I was following what Grapes of Wrath taught me and what Winesburg, Ohio taught me. So I said to the editor of Doubleday, what should I do? He said, why don't you write an outline of the Martian Chronicles, go back to the YMCA tonight and write it for me and bring it to me at Doubleday tomorrow morning, and if it's any good, I'll give you $700. So I went back to the YMCA, I wrote an outline of the Martian Chronicles, I took it in to Walter Bradbury the next day, and he read it, he said, this is it, here's $700. Now, did you have any other ideas that we can get people into thinking, or novels, even the books of short stories? I said, well, I've written a short story recently about a man with tattoos all over his body, and when they perspire, the tattoos come to life and tell their stories. He said, here's another $700. So I sold 2 books in one day, and I went home to my pregnant wife, and my life began as a family man. Yeah. So, you see, my love did it all. I did these things. I was in love, but I didn't know I was so much in